key almost slipped from my fingers twice before I got it into the lock. My hands were shaking. Not from the cold, though the October air in western Pennsylvania had teeth that night. Not from age, though 85 years will bend anyone's grip. My hands were shaking because I had not touched this door in 41 years, and the last person who opened it was my mother, Mirelle, and Mirelle had been dead since 1983. The brass was green now, oxidized, the kind of colour that forms when something metal has been ignored long enough to change its own nature. I found the key exactly where she always kept it, tucked behind the loose board inside the pantry frame, wrapped in wax paper like she was protecting a tooth from the fairy. Same spot, same wrapping. 41 years, and nobody had moved it because nobody knew it was there. Nobody except me. I pressed my thumb against the teeth of the key and felt the ridges bite into my skin. The basement door stood at the end of the hallway, past the kitchen where Mirelle used to iron pillowcases at 5 in the morning, past the spot where the wallpaper had buckled and peeled away from the plaster in long brown strips. The house smelled the way silence smells when it has been sitting in one place too long. Stale, papery, patient. I should tell you how I ended up here, standing in a dead woman's kitchen, alone, at midnight, with a certified letter folded in my coat pocket that said I had 30 days to pay $47,212 or lose the only roof left on this earth that still had my name attached to it. But I will not start there. I will start with the moment I knew my children had stopped being my children and started being strangers who shared my blood type. 9 days ago, I was sitting in my youngest son Devonte's living room in Portland. Beautiful house, reclaimed wood floors, a refrigerator that cost more than my first car. I had been there 11 days, folding myself into the guest room at the end of the hall, the one with the pull-out couch that smelled like the inside of a suitcase. 11 days of eating dinner at a table where conversation moved around me like water flowing around a stone in a creek. On the 9th evening, Devonte's wife, Charisse, was on the phone in the kitchen. She did not know I was in the hallway, or maybe she knew and had stopped caring, which was worse. "She's still here," Charisse said. The emphasis was on still. A single word that carried the full weight of a woman whose patience had been quietly converted into resentment. "I love her, I do, but Dev, your mother needs somewhere permanent. We are not a retirement home." I stood in that hallway and felt my ribs shrink around my lungs. Not because the words were cruel, they were honest. That was worse. I left Portland 2 days later, smiled at the airport, hugged Devonte and told him I would be fine. He believed me because believing me was easier than examining what fine actually meant for an 85-year-old woman with a dead husband, a dwindling savings account, and 4 children who loved her the way you love a piece of furniture from your childhood, fondly, from a distance, without any real intention of making room for it. The flight back to Pittsburgh was 3 hours and 47 minutes. I spent every one of them staring out the window, watching clouds that looked like they had been torn apart by something they could not see. When the plane landed, I took a bus 40 minutes to the town where Mirelle's house still stood on Delancey Road, 2 blocks from the old steel bridge, surrounded by maple trees that had been dropping leaves into the gutter since before I was born. The house was dark. It had been dark for years. The porch steps groaned when I climbed them. The front door stuck. Inside, the air tasted like dust that had given up trying to settle. I dropped my bag on the kitchen floor and sat down. That was when I saw the letter. It was on the table, slid through the mail slot, and leaning against a jar of dried pens like a guest who had been waiting politely for someone to come home. I opened it the way you open something when you already know it will hurt, but your fingers move anyway because your brain has not caught up to your gut. Foreclosure, forced sale, a home equity line from 2019 that my husband Orson had taken during his kidney failure. The autopay failed when his account closed after the death certificate was processed. Notices came to this address while I was living in other people's guest rooms across 4 different states. I called my children the next morning. 4 calls. Camille said she was praying for me. Terence told me to sell the furniture and let the house go. Adrian cried, and then asked about reverse mortgages. Devonte said nothing for 11 seconds, and then told me maybe it was a sign I should not be living alone anymore. 4 children, 4 college educations I helped pay for, 4 weddings I contributed to. And when I asked for the basic decency of standing beside me while I figured this out, I got prayers, advice, tears, and a suggestion that I surrender the last scrap of independence I had left. Tonight I am standing in front of this basement door with a key that smells like copper and time, and the certified letter in my pocket feels like it weighs 9 pounds. I slide the key in. The mechanism resists. I press harder. Something shifts, groans, and turns with a sound like a bone, cracking back into place. The door opens inward. The air that rises from below is dry and cool and smells like cedar and old iron. I reach for the light switch. The bulb below flickers once, twice, and holds. What I see at the bottom of those stairs will change every single thing I just told you about.
The morning after Devonte's suggestion that Lenora should stop living alone, she sat at Morel's kitchen table and did something she had not done in 3 years. She stopped pretending. The act of pretending had been the real labor of her widowhood, heavier than grief, heavier than loneliness. Heavier even than the slow understanding that her children's love had become a rotating schedule of minimum contact dressed up in the language of concern. She had performed wellness for them, smiled into phone cameras, said, "I'm fine," so many times the phrase lost its vowels. Now staring at the foreclosure letter laid flat under the morning light, she let the performance end. The kitchen was cold. The furnace had been off for months, maybe longer. A brown water stain on the ceiling above the stove had spread since her last visit, creeping outward like a bruise trying to decide how big it wanted to become. The faucet dripped in a rhythm that sounded almost deliberate, like the house was keeping time, waiting for someone to either fix it or finally walk away for good. She reread the letter. A home equity line opened in 2019 to cover Orson's medical bills when his kidneys failed. The balance restructured after a missed payment, then sold to a secondary servicer, then compounded with fees and penalties that turned a $31,000 obligation into $47,212. The autopay had been linked to Orson's checking account. When that account closed after his death, the payments stopped. The notices went to Delancey Road. Lenora was never there to receive them. She was in somebody else's guest room, folding herself small, trying not to be a burden. She picked up her phone. 4 names. 4 children she had carried, fed, driven to school, held during heartbreaks, and launched into lives that now had very little room for the woman who made them possible. Camille answered on the second ring. Her voice had that practiced warmth, the kind that comes from years of leading women's ministry groups. "Mama, what's going on? You sound tired." Lenora gave the number and the timeline. 30 days. The line was quiet for 4 full seconds. Then Camille said, "Lord have mercy. Well, Mama, I'm going to pray on this. I really am. God didn't bring you this far to leave you. Have you thought about talking to the church? Sometimes congregations have benevolence funds." Lenora thanked her and hung up. She did not have the energy to explain that she was not calling for prayers, or she was calling because she needed her daughter to act like a daughter. Terence answered while eating. She could hear him chewing something crunchy. She told him. The chewing paused. "That house is old, Ma. The market out there is dead. You might be better off just letting it go. Sell the furniture, take what you can get, and we'll figure out the next step." He would not figure out the next step. Lenora knew that the way she knew what rain smelled like before it arrived. Adrienne answered crying. She cried at commercials. She cried when someone on a cooking show got eliminated. Her tears were generous but structurally unsound, capable of covering vast emotional surfaces without ever touching the foundation underneath. "Oh, Mama, Have you looked into a reverse mortgage? My friend Delinda's mother did one, and she said it was painless. I have 30 days, Adrienne. A reverse mortgage takes months. Right? Right. Let me think. Can I call you back tomorrow? Lenora said yes. Tomorrow came. The phone did not ring. Devante picked up quickly. His voice was measured, careful, the way someone sounds when they have been expecting a call they hoped would not come. She told him everything: the amount, the deadline, the fact that she had not known the payment stopped because she had been living in other people's homes for 3 years, trying to be invisible enough to be tolerated. The silence came, not the silence of thought, the silence of a man constructing a sentence designed to sound compassionate while doing the work of a locked door. Mom, maybe this is a sign that you shouldn't be living alone anymore. It might be time to look at a community, somewhere with support, somewhere safe. He said safe the way realtors say charming. It meant something other than what it pretended to mean. Lenora closed her eyes and listened to the sound of her youngest child, the one she had rocked through colic for 4 months, the one she had driven 6 hours to watch play football at Howard University, suggest with rehearsed gentleness that the best thing she could do with the rest of her life was disappear into a building full of strangers and stop being a problem. Thank you, Devante. I'll think about it. She hung up and placed the phone face down on the table. The screen went dark. 4 calls. 4 children. 4 variations of the same message delivered in different packaging. You are on your own. Something changed inside Lenora in that moment. Not dramatic. No fist hit the table. The shift was quiet, the way a bone sets after being broken. Something that had been out of alignment for years clicked back into position, and the pain of it was sharp but clarifying. She stopped asking, not for help, for permission to exist in the lives of people who had already decided she existed too much. There is a cruelty in being reduced by the people you raised. It does not arrive with a slap. It arrives with a pause on the phone, a suggestion wrapped in concern, a holiday invitation extended with conditions, and "I love you" followed by "but." The degradation is so polite, so careful, so padded with the language of responsibility that the person being diminished often does not recognize it until they are sitting in someone else's kitchen apologizing for using the wrong towel. She did not blame them. That burned most. She understood it. She had raised practical children, ambitious children who built lives that move forward, always forward, and a mother standing still in a crumbling house in a dying steel town was not forward. She was the past, and the past was heavy, but understanding did not make it hurt less, and it did not make her helpless. She walked to the pantry, reached behind the loose board of the frame, and felt the wax paper wrapping. Inside was the brass key, heavy and green with age, the teeth still sharp enough to catch the light. Morel had kept that door locked for Lenora's entire lifetime. As a child, she had asked what was down there. The answer was always the same. Things people only understand when they've lost enough to need them. Lenora had lost enough. She walked to the door, slid the key in, and turned it. The lock opened with a sound like something exhaling after holding its breath for 41 years. Before we go on, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with yourself. When was the last time you called your mother or your father or the person who raised you, not because you needed something, not because a holiday reminded you, but simply because you remembered that they are still alive, and that alive does not mean permanent? If that question makes your chest tight right now, maybe you already know the answer, and maybe before this story goes any further, you should pick up your phone, subscribe so you remember to come back, but go call them first. They will not always be there to answer. Now. The staircase dropped into darkness. Lenora stood at the top and let her eyes adjust. The single bulb at the bottom of the steps gave off a weak amber glow, the kind of light that belongs in old photographs and hospital hallways at 3 a.m. The steps were narrow, painted gray once, years ago, now worn down to bare wood in the center where feet had pressed. Morel's feet, only Morel's feet. Nobody else had walked these stairs since before the Reagan administration. She gripped the railing. The wood was dry and smooth under her fingers, polished by decades of use and then preserved by decades of absence. She placed her right foot on the first step and felt it groan. Not dangerously, wearily, the way an old chair groans when someone sits in it after a long time standing empty. The air temperature dropped between the fourth and fifth steps, maybe 10 degrees, and the smell shifted from the stale paper scent of the upstairs hallway to something earthier. Cedar, dry iron, the ghost of wood polish, and underneath all of it, the dense quiet of a space that had been sealed and intentionally forgotten. At the bottom, Lenora stopped. She expected chaos. Every basement she had ever known was a dumping ground. Broken lamps, Christmas decorations in trash bags, water-stained cardboard collapsing under its own neglect. This was not that. This basement was organized the way an archive is organized, the way a woman who trusted no one and believed in preparation above all else would organize the most important room in her house. Metal shelving units lined the far wall, industrial grade, the kind used in warehouses and county record offices. Each shelf held labeled boxes. The labels were in Morell's handwriting, which Lenora recognized immediately. Precise, upright, no wasted curves. The letters looked like they had been measured before being committed to the cardboard. Property records, 1971 to 1980. Tax receipts active, mineral rights file, lease agreements. Delancey and Riverside, trust correspondence. Lenora read the labels twice, then a third time. In the center of the room sat a work table, heavy wood, scarred by use but clean. A yellow dust cloth had been draped over it and folded back on one end, as if Morell had been working here the last time she came down, and simply covered her station before going upstairs for the final time. On the table sat a green banker's lamp, its cord neatly coiled, a magnifying glass, a ruler. 3 pencils, sharpened to identical points and lined up parallel. Or the far corner held 3 trunks. Metal, latched but not locked. They sat side by side on a low wooden platform that kept them off the concrete floor. Next to the trunks stood a 4-drawer filing cabinet, olive green. A small padlock secured the top drawer. The other 3 were unlocked. But none of that is what stopped Lenora in her tracks. The envelope did. It sat in the exact center of the work table, positioned with the kind of deliberateness that suggested it had been placed there not casually, but ceremonially. White, yellowed at the edges. Her full name written across the front in ink that had aged from black to deep brown. Lenora Morell Vale. Her mother had used her full name, including the middle name Lenora stopped using after high school because boys in 10th grade told her it sounded old-fashioned. She reached for the envelope. Her fingers were steadier now. Something about the order of this room, the discipline of it, had calmed Lenora the way evidence calms fear. She was no longer standing in an abandoned basement. She was standing inside an answer. The flap was sealed with wax, deep red, pressed with a plain button, not a monogram. Morell was not theatrical. She was thorough. Lenora broke the seal with her thumbnail. Inside was a single sheet of heavy stock, written in the same measured hand, the ink dark enough to have been applied with a fountain pen pressed with intention into every stroke. It did not begin with Dear Lenora. It did not begin with I love you. It began with this. If you're reading this, it means the family has become careless with what it did not build. Lenora read the sentence 3 times. View slower each time. The way you read a sentence when you realize it was written about you before you existed in the form that needed to read it. She lowered herself into the wooden chair beside the work table. Solid, unforgiving, built the same way Morell built everything, to last longer than the people who doubted it. The letter continued. I did not write this to comfort you. If comfort is what you needed, you would not have come down here. I wrote this because I know what happens to women in this family when they get old. They get moved around, they get managed, they get told where to sit and when to eat, and how to be grateful for a room they did not choose in a house they do not own. I watched it happen to my mother. I watched it happen to my Aunt Janice. I decided it would not happen to me, and I prepared so that it would not have to happen to you. But I could not give you this too early. If I had told you at 40, you would have spent it. If I had told you at 60, you would have shared it with people who did not earn it. You are reading this because you have been pushed far enough to come looking, and that means you are finally ready to understand what I built. Lenore's vision blurred. She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand and kept reading. The letter was 2 pages. Morel wrote the way she spoke, without decoration, without apology, without a single wasted word. It laid out the contents of the basement in categories, what the boxes contained, what the filing cabinet held, what the trunk stored, and what all of it meant. Lenora set the letter down and looked around the room again. She was not seeing shelves and boxes anymore. She was seeing 40 years of her mother's life arranged into a system nobody knew existed, built for a daughter who had not yet needed it, preserved against a future Morel could not see, but understood with the certainty of a woman who had watched families collapse under their own carelessness her entire life. The basement was not storage. It was a lifeline, and the rope had just reached Lenora's hands. She stood, walked to the filing cabinet, and pulled open the second drawer. What she found inside would take 6 hours to read and would dismantle every assumption she had made about her mother, her family, and her own worth. The filing cabinet opened with a metallic shriek that echoed off the basement walls like a startled animal. Lenora flinched. Then she steadied herself and looked inside. But the second drawer was packed tight. Manila folders, each one labeled in Morel's handwriting, stood upright in a row so precise they could have been installed by a machine. The tabs alternated colors: yellow, blue, green, yellow, blue, green, not decorative, functional. Yellow for property, blue for financial accounts, green for legal correspondence. Lenora did not know this yet. She would figure it out within the hour, and when she did, she would sit back in the chair and press both hands flat against the table and whisper a word she had not said out loud in years. Mama. She pulled the front folder. Yellow tab, Delancey Road parcel. Original deed and transfer. Inside were documents tracing this property back to 1946, when Morel's father, a man named Booker Talmadge Spivey, purchased the lot from a widow named Edna Garrett for $1,200 cash. The deed was typed on a manual typewriter, the ink faded to the color of weak tea. Stapled to it was a handwritten note from Booker, paid in full. Nobody can take what you own outright. Lenora ran her thumb across the note. The paper was so old it felt like cloth. She pulled the next folder. Tax liens. Acquired 1981 to 1994. During the steel collapse of the early 1980s, when mills across western Pennsylvania shuttered like dominoes and entire neighborhoods emptied overnight, Morel had started buying tax liens, not properties, liens. The distinction mattered. A tax lien gave the buyer the right to collect overdue taxes plus interest from the property owner, and if the owner did not pay, the lien holder could eventually claim the property itself. It was slow, patient, an unsexy investing that required discipline, record-keeping, and the willingness to wait years for any return. It required the exact kind of temperament Morel Vale possessed in industrial quantities. The record showed that between 1981 and 1994, Morel purchased 43 tax liens, some on vacant lots, some on commercial parcels, some on residential properties whose owners had died or moved away, or simply given up during the worst economic collapse the region had ever seen. Purchase prices ranged from $87 to $2,400. Total investment over 13 years, just under $19,000. Lenora's breath caught. She pulled the next folder. Mineral rights. Gas access easement parcel 7742-B. The documents were denser, full of legal language and survey maps and notarized agreements, but the core was clear. Morel had acquired mineral rights to a strip of land outside town, part of a parcel sitting above a natural gas deposit, purchased in 1987 from a family named Okonkwo, who were liquidating their dead father's holdings without understanding what they were selling. Morel paid $3,100. The rights included a perpetual easement and a royalty interest in any commercial extraction. In 1987, the gas under that land was worthless. The technology to extract it did not exist yet, but Morel did not buy it because it was worth something then. She bought it because she understood that value is not always visible in the present tense. Lenora moved to the third drawer. Blue tabs, royalty statements. She opened the first folder and her knees nearly buckled. The statements were current, not from the 80s, not from the 90s, current. The most recent dated 8 months ago. A company called Allegheny Basin Resources had been paying quarterly royalties into the Spivey Vale Family Trust since 2011. Payments ranged between $1,400 and $3,800 per quarter, depending on gas prices and extraction volume. Consistent for over a decade, Lenora pulled out a calculator. Added the quarterly payments from the last 5 years alone, $62,340. Sitting in a trust account she did not know existed. Untouched. Accumulating. She sat down hard in the chair. The legs scraped concrete and the sound bounced off the walls and came back to her like a second gasp. Morel had not just saved money. She had built a structure, a trust, a legal entity with its own name, its own account, its own rules. And those rules, according to the green-tabbed folder Lenora pulled next, were specific in a way that made her chest ache with recognition. The trust activation clause required Lenora to present herself in person at the administering attorney's office with the original basement documents and valid photo identification. No one else could activate it. Not her children, not Orson, not a court-appointed guardian. Only Lenora, in person, with documents that could only be found if she physically entered the basement and retrieved them herself. Morel had designed a lock that could only be opened by a woman who had been forced to come looking. Lenora pressed her palms flat on the work table and looked at the shelves, the boxes, the trunks she had not yet opened, and understood something that rearranged the architecture of her grief. Her mother had known, not the specifics. Morel could not have predicted Orson's kidney failure, or the home equity line, or how Camille would offer prayers instead of presents, or how Devante would use the word safe like a padded coffin. She did not know the details, but she knew the shape of what was coming. She knew what happened to women who got old and got quiet and got moved around, and instead of surviving the pattern, she spent decades building a hidden exit. The tax liens were worth investigating. Many original properties had since been developed, and lien holders with maintained records were entitled to repayment with interest. Some of those parcels now held strip malls, gas stations, a medical office park. She walked to the shelves, ran her fingers across the labeled boxes. Insurance policies. Active. Cemetery plots. Paid in full. Correspondence. Attorney Wilton J. Hargrove, ESQ. She pulled the last box. Inside was a stack of letters between Morel and her attorney spanning 22 years. Meticulous communication about trust structure, asset protection, and estate planning. Morel had never bought a stock. She had done everything through property records, county offices, and one attorney who understood the woman across from him was not a client, but a general conducting a quiet campaign. The last letter was from Hargrove, dated February 1983. 2 months before Morel died. Dear Mrs. Vale, per your instructions, I have finalized the trust activation protocol. Access will require your daughter's personal appearance with the originals. I want to note that this level of restriction is unusual. Most clients prefer to inform their beneficiaries. You have made clear that advance notice defeats the purpose, and I have complied. I hope the circumstances that require your daughter to retrieve these documents never arise. But if they do, she will find everything in order. Lenora folded the letter and placed it back in the box. She looked at the 3 trunks, still unopened, the padlocked top drawer, still secured, the The three sharpened pencils lined up like soldiers. She thought, "You built this for me, Mama. Every folder, every label. You knew I would come down here broken, and you made sure I would climb back up with something to stand on." But inside the second page of Morel's letter, folded into the crease where the paper met itself, was a smaller note, different ink, darker, written later, maybe in the final weeks of Morel's life. "There is one more thing. It is in the first trunk. Look, it is not paper. It is not money. It is the thing I never told anyone, and it is the reason I started all of this. Open it last, after you have spoken to the attorney. You will understand." Lenora looked at the first trunk. The latch was cold under her fingers. She did not open it. Not yet. The next morning, Lenora drove 40 minutes to Pittsburgh with a manila folder on the passenger seat thick enough to prop open a door. She had not slept. Not because of anxiety, but because the basement had rearranged her understanding of time itself. She kept going back down the stairs, pulling folders, cross-referencing dates. At 2 a.m., she discovered that 7 of the 43 tax liens had converted to full property ownership through tax sale proceedings because the original owners never redeemed them. At 3:15 a.m., she found the county-recorded deed transfers confirming Morel's ownership, each one stamped and notarized with the precision of a woman who understood that paperwork was the difference between having something and being able to prove you had it. At 4:30 a.m., she opened the third filing cabinet drawer and found bank statements for the Spivey Vale Family Trust dating back to 1994. The balance on the most recent statement, 8 months old, was $214,607. $214,607. Her mother, who had worn the same 3 house dresses in rotation for the last decade of her life, who clipped coupons for dish soap and reused aluminum foil and told Lenora that new shoes were a waste when the old ones still had sole, had quietly assembled a financial safety net worth more than most people's retirement accounts. Nars, and she had told no one. Now Lenora was driving to Pittsburgh with the windows cracked because the October air kept her sharp and the coffee from 5 in the morning was wearing off. The attorney's name was not Wilton Hargrove. Hargrove was dead. But the firm still existed, absorbed into a larger practice called Hargrove, Mendelson, and Pace, with offices on Liberty Avenue near the courthouse. She parked in a garage that charged $22 for the first hour and walked 3 blocks with the folder pressed against her chest like a shield. The receptionist was a young woman with box braids and a nameplate that read Jamila. She looked at Lenora the way most people in professional settings look at 85-year-old women who arrive without an appointment. Politely, patiently, and with the unstated assumption that there had been some kind of mistake. "Can I help you, ma'am? I need to speak with someone about the Spivey Vale Family Trust." Jamila typed, blinked. "May I ask your name?" "Lenora Morel Vale." The typing stopped. Jamila picked up the phone and spoke quietly for 30 seconds. When she hung up, the polite patience was gone, replaced by something closer to attention. "Someone will be right out, Mrs. Vale. Can I get you water?" A man appeared within 4 minutes. Tall, late 50s. Gray at the temples in a way that looked intentional. His name was Gerald Pace. "Mrs. Vale, I have to be honest with you. I've been waiting to see if this day would come." He led her into a conference room with a long table and a window overlooking the street 4 floors below, closed the door. Keats sat across from her and folded his hands. "Wilton Hargrove was my mentor. When he retired in '96, he transferred all client files to the firm, but he kept one set separate. He told me about a trust with an unusual activation clause, and that one day a woman might walk in with original documents from a basement in western Pennsylvania and claim it. He told me not to go looking for her. He said the whole point was that she had to come on her own." Lenora placed the folder on the table and opened it. For 2 hours, Gerald went through every document. He verified the trust, confirmed the activation clause, checked tax lien records against county databases, called the surrogate's court, reviewed the mineral rights documentation, and confirmed Allegheny Basin Resources was still paying royalties into the trust account. He took off his glasses and set them on the table. Mrs. Vale, your mother was one of the most careful people I have ever encountered through a file. Everything here is legitimate. The trust is properly formed. The assets are real. The mineral rights are active and current. Several tax lines have matured into property holdings that have appreciated significantly, and the trust account balance is $214,607. He paused. That does not include the appraised value of the 7 properties, ongoing mineral royalties, or recovery value of remaining liens. Combined estate value likely exceeds $600,000, possibly more. Lenora sat very still. $600,000. Her mother, a woman who did bookkeeping for contractors and county clerks, Taipei, who lived in a house with 1 bathroom and a furnace that rattled, who never took a vacation that was not a bus trip to see a cousin in Virginia, had built a $600,000 estate in a locked basement using patience, public records, and the conviction that the women in her family would eventually need a way out that nobody else would provide. The foreclosure on my house, Lenora said. Can this stop it? Easily. We can cure the default from the trust within days. We can also transfer the property into a protected trust structure. Your mother anticipated this. There is a provision for exactly this scenario. She wrote a provision for it. She did. Lenora pressed her palms against the conference table. She was grounding herself against something solid to make sure the world was still real and the numbers were not the architecture of a dream. I want to move forward. Today. Gerald was not surprised. Wilton had told him the woman who eventually came for this trust would not be the kind to hesitate. Over 5 days, Lenora's life restructured itself with the efficiency of a building going up where a ruin used to stand. Gerald cured the foreclosure default, filed paperwork to transfer the property into the trust's protective framework, initiated conversion of remaining tax liens into formal claims, scheduled appraisals of the 7 properties, confirmed mineral rights payments, and redirected future royalties into a new account under Lenora's direct control. Lenora did not tell her children any of this. Well, she did not call Camille to report the miracle, did not update Terence on the market value of the house he told her to abandon, did not return Adrian's belated text that read, "Thinking of you, Mama, praying hard," did not call Devante at all. She was not punishing them. She was operating. For the first time in 3 years, making decisions that affected her own life without filtering them through the opinions, convenience, or approval of people who had already demonstrated that their concern was conditional. She hired a locksmith to replace every lock on the Delancey Road house, a plumber to fix the faucet and repair the water line to the furnace. She bought groceries. She turned on every light in the house and left them burning until morning, not because she feared the dark, but because she wanted the house to know someone was home. On the 6th day, her phone rang. Camille. Mama, I've been trying to reach you. Devante said you sounded different last time you talked. What's going on? Lenora listened, not to the words, to the frequency beneath them. The signal that carries information the speaker does not intend to transmit. She heard it clearly now, the way a person hears a note they have been misidentifying for years. Concern. Yes. But underneath the concern, something sharper. Something that moved like a hand reaching for a door handle in the dark. Camille was not calling because she was worried about her mother. She was calling because something in the pattern had changed, and changes in the pattern made Camille nervous. I'm fine, Camille. You sound different. Do I? Are you still at the house? Or did you figure out the mortgage thing? I handled it. A pause, long enough to fit a lie inside. Handled it how? I handled it, Camila. That's all you need to know right now. Another pause. This one was not confusion. This one was calculation. Okay, Mama. Well, if you need anything, I know where to reach you. Lenora hung up. She placed the phone on the kitchen table and looked at the basement door, now closed, the brass key sitting beside a cup of tea that had gone cold. On the other side of that door, inside 3 trunks she still had not opened, sat secrets Morel had carried alone for decades. The letter said to open the first trunk last after speaking to the attorney. She had spoken to the attorney. The trunk was waiting, and Lenora had the feeling, deep in the quiet part of her chest where intuition lives, that what she found inside would not just change her finances, it would change the reason she had been put on this earth. Lenora wept at the work table for 11 minutes before she understood why. It was not the money. The money mattered, yes. $214,000 in a trust account, 7 properties, mineral rights still generating quarterly checks, a foreclosure that could be cured with a single phone call to Gerald Pace. All of that mattered. But that was not why her body was folded over Myrelle's letter at 1 in the morning, tears dropping onto paper that was older than some of her grandchildren, her shoulders shaking with a grief so deep it did not make noise. She wept because her mother had known that Lenora would end up here. Not the specifics, not the names, not the dates, not the certified letter or the home equity line or the 11 seconds of silence from Devante, but the pattern, the shape of it, the way families slowly convert their eldest women from people into problems, the way love gets restructured into logistics, the way a mother who raised 4 children can end up rotating through guest rooms like a suitcase nobody wants to unpack. Morel had seen that future 40 years before it arrived, and instead of warning Lenora, which would have changed nothing, she built a floor underneath the fall. That was what broke Lenora open, not discovery, recognition. She pressed her palms against the table and pushed herself upright. Her face was wet. Her chest hurt the way it hurts after you've been holding something inside your ribs for so long that releasing it feels like surgery. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked around the basement again. The shelves, the filing cabinet, the 3 trunks, the pencils, in the banker's lamp. Every object placed with the deliberateness of a woman who did not trust the future to be kind but refused to let it win. Lenora picked up the letter again. She had read it twice already. Now she read it a 3rd time, slower. The way you read scripture when you finally understand it was written for you specifically. The 2nd page ended with instructions, clear, ordered, Morel to the last syllable. Go to the attorney first, verify everything, protect the house. Then, and only then, open the first trunk. Inside you will find the thing I never told anyone. It is the reason I started all of this. It is not money, it is not paper. It is what happens when a woman decides she will never again be the person other people define. Lenora set the letter down and walked to the trunks. She had been told to wait. Berard to speak to the attorney first. She had done that. Gerald Pace had verified every document. The trust was real. The assets were real. The house was protected. She had followed every instruction in order, the way Morel had designed it, and now the only thing left was the trunk that her mother had saved for last. The first trunk sat on the left side of the wooden platform. It was smaller than the other 2. Dark metal, a simple latch. No lock. Lenora placed her hand on the lid and felt the cold seep into her palm. She lifted the latch. The hinge resisted for a moment, stiff with age, and then released. Inside, the trunk was lined with cedar. The smell rose immediately, sharp and clean, and for a moment Lenora was 9 years old again, standing in Morel's bedroom. Watching her mother fold linens into a cedar chest with hands that moved like they were performing a ceremony rather than a chore. On top of the cedar lining sat a cloth bundle, wrapped in dark blue fabric, tied with kitchen twine. Lenora lifted it out. It was lighter than she expected. She set it on the work table and untied the twine. Inside the cloth was a photograph, black and white, creased down the middle where it had been folded and then carefully flattened. The edges were soft with age. The image showed a young woman, maybe 22 or 23, standing in front of a building Lenora did not recognize. The woman wore a dark dress with a white collar. Her hair was pinned back. Her expression was not a smile. It was something more complicated than a smile. It was the face of a woman who had just made a decision that would cost her everything she had and give her everything she needed. The woman was Morel. Lenora turned the photograph over. On the back, in pencil, In handwriting younger and less controlled than the Morel she knew were 3 lines. The day I left. October 14th, 1952. Nobody gets to tell me where I belong ever again. Lenora sat down. Beneath the photograph was a second item, a small leather journal the size of a hymn book, with pages so thin they felt like they might dissolve between her fingers. She opened it to the first page. The journal was Morel's, written between 1950 and 1953. It documented in Morel's young handwriting the 3 years she spent living with relatives in Virginia after her own mother died, relatives who took her in and then used her, who put her to work cooking, cleaning, and caring for their children while they spent the money her mother had left behind, who told her she was lucky to have a roof, who sold her mother's house without telling her and split the money among themselves, who looked her in the face when she asked where the money went and said, "You should be grateful we kept you at all." Morel was 19 when her mother died, 22 when she walked out of that house in Virginia with nothing but the dress she was wearing and a decision carved into her chest like an inscription on stone. Nobody gets to tell me where I belong ever again. She came to Pennsylvania. She got a job doing bookkeeping for a construction company. She married Booker's son, a quiet man named Harold Vail, who died young. She raised Lenora alone, and in the decades that followed, she built the basement. Not out of greed, not out of paranoia, out of the absolute bone-deep refusal to let what happened to her happen to her daughter. Lenora closed the journal and held it against her chest. She understood now. The trust was not a financial instrument. It was a letter written in property law and tax receipts and mineral rights. A letter that said, "I was once powerless, and I spent the rest of my life making sure you would never have to be." The tears came again, but these were different. These were the tears of a woman who had just met her mother for the first time at 85 years old. She placed the journal and the photograph back in the trunk. She closed the lid. She turned off the banker's lamp and climbed the stairs. At the top, she closed the basement door and locked it, not to hide it, to honor it. Morel had carried this alone for 40 years. She never told a soul, never asked for credit, never said, "Look what I built for you." She simply built it, sealed it, and trusted that the day would come when it would matter. That day had come, and Lenora was not the same woman who had walked down those stairs. Gerald Pace called at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning with news that moved faster than Lenora expected. 3 of the 7 properties Morel had acquired through converted tax liens had been appraised in the last 48 hours. The results were not subtle. A parcel on Riverside that Morel had claimed for $1,600 in unpaid taxes was now worth $127,000 as part of a commercial strip. A vacant lot on Miller Avenue, acquired for $340, sat adjacent to a medical complex and appraised at $89,000. The third, Manzanero lot near the old rail yard, was under review for a municipal development project and carried a preliminary valuation of $61,000. Lenora listened to the numbers from the kitchen table, a cup of black coffee cooling in front of her, the morning light coming through the window at the angle that made the dust in the air look like tiny witnesses floating in place. "Your mother bought distress at the right time and held it with discipline," Gerald said. "That is the simplest explanation I can give you. She bought what nobody wanted, and she kept records that most attorneys would envy. I have seen estates put together by people with 10 times the resources and half the organization." Lenora did not respond immediately. She was thinking about the journal, the photograph. You're the girl in the dark dress standing in front of a building in Virginia, choosing to leave with nothing rather than stay with people who had stolen her inheritance and called it generosity. She was thinking about how that girl became the woman who spent 40 years building a locked basement, and how that locked basement had just handed Lenora more stability than her 4 children had offered in 3 years combined. "What happens next?" Lenora asked. "We continue the appraisals. We formalize the remaining lien conversions, and we file the trust activation with the surrogates court so you have full legal control." You should also think about what you want to do with the assets long term. Some of these properties could be sold, others could be leased. Well, the mineral rights will continue generating income on their own. I want the Delancey Roadhouse repaired, Lenora said. That is the first thing. Everything else can wait. The house cannot. Already in motion. The title is clean. The default is cured. I have a contractor referral if you want it. I want it. She hung up and sat with the silence. The house was different now. Not the structure. The structure was the same cracked plaster and groaning pipes it had been for decades. But the meaning of the house had changed. It was no longer the last thing she was about to lose. It was the first thing she was choosing to keep. And there is a difference between those two things that most people will never understand until they have lived through both. She hired the contractor Gerald recommended, a man named Wardell Sims, mid-60s. Who arrived in a truck that looked like it had seen more honest work than most people do in a lifetime. Wardell walked through the house slowly, touching walls and testing floors the way a doctor touches a patient during a checkup that matters. He did not rush. He did not try to sell her services she did not need. He pressed his thumb against a doorframe, knocked on a support beam with his knuckle, and crouched down to examine the baseboards with the respect of a man who understood that old houses carry history in their joints. This house has good bones, he said. The foundation is solid. Roof needs patching, not replacing. Plumbing's old but functional. The real work is cosmetic, paint, trim, floors, new fixtures in the bathroom. I can have it done in 3 weeks if the weather holds. Do it, Lenora said. Wardell looked at her. See, he was the kind of man who could read a room before anyone in it spoke. You plan on staying? I plan on living here for as long as I'm alive, and when I'm gone, this house will belong to someone who earned it. He nodded once. That was enough for both of them. While Wardell and his two-man crew worked upstairs, Lenora continued going through the basement each evening. She opened the second and third trunks. The second held copies of every document from the filing cabinet, organized identically, a complete backup system in case the originals were ever damaged. Morel had duplicated her own archive. The woman had built a redundancy plan for a redundancy plan. The third trunk held personal effects, Morel's bookkeeping tools, a wooden box of fountain pens, a Bible with passages underlined in pencil. Nice, the margins filled with notes so small they required the magnifying glass from the work table to read. A recipe book written in Morel's hand, each recipe annotated with the name of who had taught it to her and the year she learned it. A pair of reading glasses in a cracked leather case. Lenora carried the Bible upstairs and placed it on the kitchen table beside her own. On Thursday, 2 days into the renovation, her phone buzzed. A text from Terrence. Ma, Camille says you handled the house situation. What does that mean? Did you sell? Lenora read the message and set the phone down. She did not reply. Not because she was angry, because she was busy, and because she had learned in the span of 2 weeks that the people who reach out when the pattern changes are not always reaching out because they care about you. Sometimes they are reaching out because they care about the pattern. Adrienne called that evening. Her voice had the slightly breathless quality of someone who had been talking to other people about you before calling you directly. Mama, what's going on? Camille said you told her you handled the mortgage. Terrence is texting me. Are you okay? I'm fine, Adrienne. But what did you do? Where did you get the money? Mama, you can tell me. I'm your daughter. There it was. Not, are you safe? Not, do you need anything? Not, can I come visit? The question was, where did you get the money? The emphasis was on get. As if the only version of Lenora that made sense to her daughter was the version that had nothing. I found what I needed, Adrienne. That's all I'm ready to share right now. But, Mama, I love you. I will talk to you soon. She hung up. The phone sat on the table like a small rectangular argument she had just won without raising her voice. Wardell's drill hummed from the bathroom down the hall. The house was being rebuilt around her while her children tried to figure out how an 85-year-old woman they had written off had suddenly become someone they could not predict. The answer was in the basement, and Lenora was not ready to share it. Not yet. Not until they were all in the same room. Not until they could see the shelves and the filing cabinet and the work table with their own eyes. Not until she could look each of them in the face and say what Morel never got the chance to say. I was never helpless. You just stopped looking close enough to see. Devante called on a Saturday. And his voice carried the weight of a man who had been losing sleep over a question he could not figure out how to ask. Mom, I need to understand what's happening. Lenora was sitting on the front porch of the Delancey Road house. The porch had been repainted 2 days earlier. Wardell's crew had replaced the railing and sanded the floorboards, and put in new steps that did not groan when weight was applied. The maple trees along the street were in full October color, orange and red, and a yellow so bright it looked electric, and the air smelled like cold earth and something almost sweet, the last breath of warmth before winter closed its hand around the valley. What do you mean, Devante? Camille says you fixed the mortgage. Terrence says you're renovating. Adrian says you won't explain where the money came from. I just need to know you're not being taken advantage of. Lenora almost smiled. Almost. Because the concern in his voice was real, she could hear that, but the direction of it was wrong. He was not worried that she was suffering. He was worried that someone else had gotten to her before he figured out what was going on. The distinction between those two concerns is the distance between love and accounting, and Lenora heard it clearly. Nobody is taking advantage of me. Then where did the money come from, Mom? From someone who loved me enough to plan ahead. Silence. The kind of silence that means a person is recalculating, running numbers they did not know were in play, adjusting a picture they thought was already complete and framed and hanging on the wall. What does that mean? It means I would like you and your brother and your sisters to come to the house next Sunday, all 4 of you. I have something I want to show you, and I want everyone present when I show it. Mom, I'm in Portland. That's a 5-hour flight. I know how far Portland is, Devante. I've made the trip. That landed. She could hear it land the way you hear glass hit a hard floor. The memory of her sitting in his guest room for 11 days, sleeping on a pull-out couch that smelled like luggage, overhearing Charisse count the days like someone counting remaining patience before a lease expires. I'll be there, he said. Thank you. She called the other 3 that afternoon. Camille said she would drive from Atlanta 8 hours and make it a ministry road trip. Terrence said he would fly from Columbus, which was only an hour away, but felt like a concession the way he said it, like he was doing her a large and measurable favor. Adrian said she would come from Tucson and asked 3 times what the meeting was about and whether she should bring anything. I will explain everything on Sunday, Lenora said each time. She gave no further details. Details she had learned were currency, and she was done spending before she was ready. The week passed slowly. Wardle finished the bathroom and started on the kitchen. New cabinet hardware, fresh paint on the walls in a color called warm linen that Lenora had chosen herself from a fan deck of 60 options, a countertop that did not wobble when you pressed it. He replaced the light fixture above the stove, and suddenly the kitchen looked like a place where someone was expected to cook meals and eat them and be alive in a way that mattered. Lenora went to the basement each evening after Wardle and his crew left for the day. She organized the documents Gerald would need for the remaining appraisals. She inventoried the second and third trunks and made a list of contents in her own handwriting on a yellow legal pad. She reread Morel's journal twice. She sat in the wooden chair and placed her hand on the work table and felt the scarred surface that her mother's hands had touched hundreds of times over 4 decades of quiet, secret, relentless preparation. On Friday, Gerald called with the final appraisal numbers. The total combined value of the trust, including liquid assets, property holdings, or active mineral rights, and recoverably lien values, was $687,000. Lenora wrote the number on a piece of paper and placed it in the manila folder she was assembling for Sunday. Saturday night, she could not sleep, not from worry, from anticipation, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind. She lay in the bed she had shared with Orson for 31 years, in a room that smelled like fresh paint and cedar. and thought about what she would say to her children when they stood in the basement and saw what Morel had built. She would not yell. She would not lecture. She would not perform the wounded mother seeking applause for her suffering. She had spent enough years performing for people who gave her polite reviews and empty seats. She would simply show them, and then she would say what needed to be said. Sunday morning arrived the way all reckoning days arrive, ordinary on the surface, a clear sky, cold air, the kind of October light that makes everything look sharper than it normally does, as if the sun itself is trying to make sure you see clearly what you have been refusing to look at. Camille arrived first, at 10:14 a.m., in a rental car, wearing a church dress and heels, which meant she had come prepared to perform compassion and expected to be seen doing it. Terence arrived at 10:30, hands in his pockets, looking around the renovated exterior, with an expression that was trying very hard not to be surprised and failing. Adrienne walked through the door at 10:47 with red eyes and a casserole dish she had picked up at a deli in town because Adrienne believed food was the answer to every question she was afraid to ask directly. Devante was last. He came through the door at 11:02. He looked at his mother. He looked at the repainted walls, the new kitchen fixtures, the restored floors, the house that had been quietly and thoroughly rebuilt in the 3 weeks since he suggested she move into a facility for her own safety. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved across every surface like a man reading a room he no longer recognized. "Mom, this looks nice." "Thank you, Devante. Have a seat." They gathered in the kitchen. 4 adults in their 50s and 60s. One mother at 85, 5 cups of coffee on the table. A silence that felt like the space between a question and an answer that everyone in the room already knew was coming, but nobody wanted to hear out loud. "I brought you here because I need you to see something," Lenora said. "And I need you to understand what it means. Not later, not on the phone. Right now." She stood. She walked to the basement door. She pulled the brass key from her pocket and unlocked it. "Follow me." The staircase held all 5 of them, though just barely. Lenora went first, her hand on the railing, her steps steady and sure on the bare wood that had carried only 2 sets of feet in its entire existence, Morel's and now hers. Behind her, Camille descended in heels that clicked against each step, like a nervous clock. Terence came next, ducking slightly though the ceiling was high enough, a habit of a tall man entering spaces he did not trust. Adrienne followed, with one hand on the wall and one hand pressed against her stomach, the way people hold themselves when they are bracing for something they cannot name. Devante came last. He stood at the top of the stairs for 3 full seconds before he committed to the first step, and Lenora did not turn around because she did not need to. She knew that pause. She had made it herself 2 weeks ago. At the bottom, the basement opened before them. Nobody spoke. Camilla's hand went to her mouth. Terence took 2 steps forward and then stopped, his eyes moving across the shelves like a man reading a sentence he did not believe. Adrienne made a small sound, something between a gasp and the beginning of a word she could not finish. Devante stood perfectly still, his arms at his sides, his face doing the work of a man whose entire understanding of his grandmother was being dismantled one labeled box at a time. Lenora gave them 60 seconds of silence. She had earned that. Morel had earned that. By 60 seconds for 4 adults to stand in a room built by a woman they had never truly known and feel the weight of what preparation looks like when it is done by someone who expects nothing from the people it is designed to save. Then Lenora spoke. "Your grandmother, Morel, built this over 40 years. She did it alone. She told no one. Not your grandfather. Not me. Not a single friend or family member. She bought tax liens during the steel collapse. She acquired mineral rights when the gas under this land was worthless. She set up a trust with an attorney named Wilton Hargrove and designed an activation clause that required me, personally, to come down here with the original documents before anyone could access it." She paused. She did this because she knew what happens to women in this family when they get old. She watched it happen to her own mother. She watched it happen to her Aunt Janice, and she was right to be afraid. Because it almost happened to me. The basement was silent except for the hum of the old light fixture above the work table. I want you to understand something, Lenora continued. I did not bring you down here to punish you. I did not bring you here to shame you. I brought you here because you need to see what it looks like when someone loves you enough to plan for the version of your life you hoped would never come. Your grandmother never met your children. She never saw the houses you built, or the careers you chose, or the people you married. But she knew that one day I would be old and alone and in trouble, and she made sure that when that day came, I would have something to stand on. She walked to the work table and placed her hand on the surface. The trust is worth $687,000. It includes 7 properties, active mineral rights, and a funded account. The foreclosure on this house has been cured. The property is protected. I am not broke. I am not confused. I am not a problem that needs to be managed. Camilla lowered her hand from her mouth. Her eyes were wet. Mama, I had no idea Grandma... Nobody did. That was the point. Terence cleared his throat. His voice was smaller than Lenora had heard it in years. What are you going to do with all of it? I'm going to live in this house. I'm going to maintain what your grandmother built. And I'm going to make decisions about my life without asking permission from anyone who has already told me in 4 different ways, Mom, that I was on my own. Adrienne was crying, quietly, steadily. But these were not the performative tears Lenore had heard on the phone weeks ago. These were the tears of a woman who had just realized that her absence had been measured and recorded by someone she could no longer apologize to. Devante had not moved. He stood in the same spot where he had landed at the bottom of the stairs. His arms were still at his sides. His face was still. When he finally spoke, his voice came from somewhere lower than his chest. Did you think we didn't care? Lenora looked at her youngest son. She looked at him the way a mother looks at a child when the truth is more important than comfort, when the answer will cost something and she has decided to pay it anyway. I think you cared, Devante. I believe that. But care that arrives only when control is threatened is not care. It is management. And I am done being managed. The sentence filled the room the way water fills a glass. Completely, without a single space left for argument. Nobody responded. Nobody tried to defend. Nobody said, but that's not fair, or you don't understand how busy we are. They stood in a basement built by a grandmother they had underestimated and listened to a mother they had underestimated and for the first time in years had nothing to say that would make it better. Lenora was not finished. Your grandmother left me a journal. She kept it when she was young. After her own mother died, she was taken in by relatives who used her, stole her inheritance, and told her to be grateful for a roof. She was 22 when she walked out of that house with nothing but a dress and a decision. The decision was that nobody would ever tell her where she belonged again. She picked up the photograph from the work table where she had placed it that morning. This is her, the day she left. She held the photograph so they could see it. The young woman in the dark dress, the white collar, the expression that was not a smile, the 3 lines in pencil on the back that none of them would ever forget. The day I left. October 14th, 1952. Nobody gets to tell me where I belong ever again. Camille reached for the photograph. She held it with both hands. Terence leaned in. Adrienne pressed her fingers to her lips. Devante stared at the image, and Lenora watched him see, perhaps for the first time, that the grandmother he remembered as a quiet woman in a small house had once been a girl on fire with the kind of fury that does not burn outward but hardens into something permanent and useful and unbreakable. I am not angry at you, Lenora said, but I am different now, and you need to be different with me, not because of the money, because I have finally become the woman your grandmother built this basement for. She let that settle. Now, I made lunch. Let's go upstairs. 6 months later, the Delancey Roadhouse looked like someone had reached back 40 years and pulled forward only the things worth keeping. Wardle had finished the renovation in November. New paint inside and out, restored hardwood floors, A kitchen that hummed with modern function but kept the bones Morel had built around. The front porch held 2 rocking chairs and a small table where Lenora drank her morning coffee at 6 a.m., wrapped in a blanket Devante had sent from Portland. Not an expensive blanket this time. A handmade one, quilted, with a note attached that said only, "I should have been there sooner." The basement remained locked. Lenora went down once a week to review documents, manage correspondence with Gerald Pace, and sit in the wooden chair where Morel had sat for decades. She did not need to go down that often. The practical work was handled. But the visits were not practical. They were devotional. The way a person returns to a church, not because they have to, but because the space itself reminds them who they have decided to be. Gerald had completed the full estate realization over the winter. Momo, 2 of the 7 properties were sold for a combined $216,000. The remaining 5 were placed under long-term lease agreements that generated $3,400 per month in rental income. The mineral rights continued producing quarterly royalties. The trust account, after the foreclosure cure and renovation expenses, held $193,000 in liquid funds. Total asset value, stable and growing, just under $700,000. Lenora did not live lavishly. She never had. That was not the point, and never would be. She bought a reliable car. She paid off a small medical bill from Orson's estate that had been lingering like a headache nobody could locate. She donated $5,000 to the church where she had been a member for 30 years. She hired a part-time caregiver, a woman named Coretta, not because Lenora could not manage alone, but because she had learned the difference between independence and isolation, and she chose help on her own terms rather than waiting for someone to assign it to her. Her relationship with her children changed. Not overnight. Not in the ways movies suggest, where one tearful confrontation rewrites decades of distance. Real change is slower than that. Quieter. It looks like phone calls that happen on Tuesdays, for no reason. It looks like Camille visiting for 5 days in January and not once mentioning the money. It looks like Terrence sending a text that said, "I'm sorry I told you to sell the furniture, Ma. That was small of me." Adrienne came in February. She sat in the kitchen and asked Lenora to tell her about Morel. Not about the trust, not about the money, about who Morel was, what she liked to cook, how she kept her house, why she wore the same 3 house dresses, what her laugh sounded like. Lenora talked for 2 hours straight. It was the first time she had ever told her children the truth about their grandmother, and it was the first time any of them had asked. Devante came in March. He came alone. No Charisse. No agenda. He sat in the basement for 45 minutes reading Morel's journal while Lenora waited upstairs. When he climbed back up, his eyes were red and his hands were steady, and he said, "I understand now. I understand why you didn't tell us right away." "Why do you think I waited?" "Because you needed to know we would come without being told there was something to gain." Lenora nodded. That was exactly right. She opened the last trunk on a Sunday in April, the one she had not touched since the night she found the photograph. Inside, beneath the cedar lining, was one final item Morel had placed there. A deed. Not to a property, not to a mineral parcel. A deed to a cemetery plot purchased in 1979, large enough for 2 headstones located in the small burial ground behind Mount Zion AME Church. One headstone was already engraved, Morel Josephine Spivey Vale, born 1929, died 1983. She built what others could not see. The second headstone was blank, purchased, paid for, waiting. Morel had bought Lenora's final resting place 44 years before Lenora would need it, in the same quiet, deliberate, unannounced way she had built everything else. No drama, no declaration. Just certainty that the women in her family deserved to end their lives on ground they owned. We beside someone who had loved them with actions instead of words. Lenora ran her fingers across the deed and sat with it for a long time. She was not sad. She was completed. The way a sentence is completed when the final word arrives and the meaning suddenly holds. On a warm evening in May, Lenora sat on the front porch with a glass of sweet tea and watched the maple trees shift in the wind. The street was quiet. Wardell's truck was gone for the season. The house behind her was warm and lit and full of the kind of order that a woman builds when she has finally decided that her life belongs to her and no one else. She thought about the girl in the photograph, 22 years old, standing in front of a building in Virginia, choosing to walk away with nothing but dignity and a decision that would echo through 3 generations. Or she thought about the basement, about the 40 years of silence that turned out to be louder than any conversation her family had ever had. And she thought about what she would say if Morel could hear her now. You were right, Mama. They did become careless with what they did not build. But I found it. I found everything you left me, and I am standing on it. The wind moved through the maple trees. The porch chair rocked. The tea was cold, but she did not go inside. She sat there, in her house, on her porch, in a life she had chosen to reclaim rather than surrender, and she felt, for the first time in more years than she could count, like a woman whose name still meant something. Not because of the money in the trust, not because of the properties or the mineral rights, or the $700,000 that now protected her future. Yeah, because she had learned what Morel always knew, that humiliation should never be accepted as normal, that dependence should never be mistaken for love, that the women who build quietly are the ones who change everything, and that what looks abandoned, what looks finished, what looks like it has nothing left to give, may still hold a future so powerful that the only thing standing between you and that future is the courage to unlock the door and walk down the stairs. If this story moved something inside you, if it reminded you of a mother or a grandmother or a woman in your life who gave more than she ever received, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a word in the comments. Tell us who that woman was for you. Your story might be the one that reaches someone sitting alone tonight, wondering if anyone remembers what they built. Subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story like this. We're here every week with new stories of strength, survival, and the quiet power of people the world underestimates. This is just the beginning. The next story is already waiting, and it might be the one that changes your life.